that on now? Open your Bibles with me, please, to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and you can leave you a marker there. We'll be coming back. But once you left your marker there in 2 Corinthians 12, please come back with me to the Old Testament, to Numbers chapter 33. Numbers chapter 33, and we'll begin there. I had the last classes of Numbers out here in the large auditorium, and I had chapter 33, and as I was reading chapter 33, I noticed something. It stood out to me. It caught my attention, and I hadn't noticed it before. But when you get down to the end of chapter 33, the context here is Moses, speaking for the Lord, is trying to prepare the children of Israel to go over into the promised land. You know, they could have went in a long time ago, but they disobeyed God. They wouldn't listen. So God caused them to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Now that 40-year period has ceased, and now it's time for these people to enter into the land. They need to be reminded of God's laws. They need to know that there's going to be some things that need to be taken care of before we go. But also, He just wants to remind them of some things that they must do once they get into the land. Look with me at verse 55, Numbers chapter 33. Moses says, "But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall be that those whom you let remain shall be irritants in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall harass you in the land where you dwell. Moreover, it shall be that I will do to you as I thought to do to them." What he's talking about is those people among the land of Canaan, those nations that they were supposed to drive out, the idolatrous nations. He said, I need you to get rid of those people, because if you don't, what's going to happen is they're going to influence you. They're going to be thorns in your sides. They're going to be irritants in your eyes. The problem's going to be is they're going to draw you away from me. And the thing that I was going to do to them, I'm going to then do to you because of what they've become to you, a thorn in your side. Go over to the book of Joshua. Joshua chapter 23. Notice Joshua speaking almost the same thing here. Just reminding them of what the Lord had said. You had God's people here who were wavering. Some thinking about going into idolatry in regard to the things the other nations practice. Notice what Joshua has to say in verse 13. We pick up mid-thought with him, but we can make our point. Know that for certain the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps to you, and scourges on your side, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land which the Lord your God has given you. Almost a verbatim statement. That the Lord is going to allow these people, if you do not do what you need to do before your God, they will be thorns in your flesh, thorns in your eyes. They will become hindrances to you. But they didn't do what the Lord asked them to do. Go over to Judges chapter 2. A reminder here of why we've come to the point we have now with Israel. Judges chapter 2, and look at verse 1. Then the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochum and said, I led you from Egypt and brought you to the land which I swore to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side, and their gods shall be a snare to you. Eventually, exactly what happened was what God prophesied way back before those people ever crossed the Jordan River. Is that if you don't do what you need to do in getting these people out of the land, then these people are going to be what? Thorns in your side. They're going to be irritants to your eyes. These people are going to lead you astray, and it's going to cause me to break my fellowship with you. What's interesting is when you come back now to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, we read again about a thorn in the flesh. I only read those passages because it's interesting that they they speak of thorns in the flesh in regard to people. A lot of times we come to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and that's the passage that we think about of having a thorn in the flesh. And Paul says he has one too. Look at verse 7. Having already spoken of himself, needing to boast in regard to some things, because the false teachers in Corinth were doing that. But Paul said, I'm going to do it backwards. I'm going to boast in my weakness, so that I can show that the strength that I have is not found in me, but it's found in Christ. Paul had seen some wonderful things that no one else had been able to see, but he had been humbled at the same time. And that humility caused him to boast in his weakness. In that regard, look at verse 7 of chapter 12. And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, I plead with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. There's been discussion from as long as we've had these scriptures, I'm sure. And people were far enough removed from it to not know what Paul's thorn was. They've always reasoned and discussed, what in the world was he talking about? What was his thorn in the flesh? Well, if I just take the information that I have from the Old Testament passages, it seems when God says that there's a thorn in the flesh, He always used that in regard to people. And when you read 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians 11, I think you find clearly what Paul's thorn in the flesh was. It was the persecution of unbelieving people that were giving him the hard time that he wanted to get rid of. He prayed for that. Look at verse 24 of chapter 11. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil and sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Besides the other things, there was more. What's he talking about there? He's talking about the constant persecution he was always having to look out for, to look over his shoulder. He laid awake at night because persecution was always breathing down his throat. Can you see why when he prayed to God, I got a thorn in the flesh. Take this away from me. And he even validates that even more in verse 10. He talked about infirmities, reproaches, persecutions, distresses. Seems like that the context of 2 Corinthians tells us what Paul's thorn in the flesh was. I don't think we have to wonder about that. It was the persecution that the people were bringing upon him. Now, that may cause us to wonder, well, how in the world am I ever going to make any application like that to myself? Because we have used this passage for a long time to use it in regard to the trials of life that we have to go through. Well, I think we can always do that. Because what was behind the persecution of Paul? What was at the source of it? It was Satan. Satan's at the source of that sin that was coming against Paul, trying to persecute him and get rid of it. Satan's behind all of that. Satan's the reason that we live in a fallen world, that sin is present. Satan's the reason that we live in a world where there's sorrow and pain and sickness and dying and difficulty. Because all of those things were not present until Adam and Eve fell victim to Satan's deception. And now we're having to face that world. That's the reason Paul was facing what he's facing here. That's why he had his thorn. That's why the children of Israel had their thorn. It's because we live in a fallen world. And none of us are exempt from the thorns of life. And there are many thorns that we face. They come in different shapes and sizes. And I think we can all understand why God used the analogy of the thorns. Have you ever had to clean off a fence row? I've cleaned off many. Looked a lot like this when you were having to go down it too. You ever pick blackberries? I've picked a lot. And most of the time you're picking them in stuff that looks like this. And you have to be very careful how you navigate these things. I know those things sound very simple, but you know what? When you're dealing with thorns, it's never easy. But you have a goal that's out there that you want to accomplish. I want to clean off this fence row. I want to pick a big bucket of blackberries. But you have to be careful about how you deal with the thorns therein, because it can make your life much worse before you can finish. It's all about how you handle them. And if you've ever dealt with thorns like this, you understand the analogy. Our thorns of life are just that way. They come in many different shapes and sizes. And they can bring to us great difficulty. We have to be very careful how we handle them. But they can be of great benefit to us. And that's what I want us to look at this morning. I want us to look at how Paul handled his thorn. What are some things he did to bring him to understand the benefit that was found therein without having a substitute for it? As we do that, first of all, notice with me that when it came to Paul's thorn, he didn't blame God. And we shouldn't blame God either. But that's really the natural inclination, isn't it? When we begin to have hard times in our life and things become difficult, we've never had to face these things before. The first thing that happens is we begin to blame God for the misfortunes that we have in our life. How many times have you heard someone say, maybe even to you, maybe you've even said this in a weak moment, I can't believe God is doing this to me. Why is God putting me through this? What have I done to God for Him to throw this in my lap? Well, God must not love me, or even more so, God must not even be real. If God was truly a great God, why would I be going through something like this? Haven't we all heard that? Some of us even said that before. Because, again, that's human nature. We're inclined for that to be our first thought. God, why are you doing this to me? But what we find from Paul is he said that God wasn't responsible. He said someone entirely different was responsible for that. Because that's not on God's end of the stick there. God doesn't cause these things because God doesn't tempt us. I want you to leave your marker in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and go with me over to James chapter 1, please. James chapter 1. James is writing in this letter, in this chapter, in the context of Christians dealing with trials. There's some brethren in these areas, these local churches that James's letter is being circulated among, who are dealing with hard times and difficulties. And James writes to encourage them. I want you to pick up with me in chapter 1 and verse 12. Speaking of these people, he says, Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been proved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised of those who love Him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does He Himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. When it is full grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Walk it back from verse 16. Do not be deceived about what? Don't be deceived, or don't even deceive yourself into thinking that God brought this on you. Don't be deceived and convince yourself that God is causing you to go through this hard time, that He's the reason for the difficulty. That's not true. Temptation in verse 12. Well, you can be tempted by a trial that you're going through just to give up, just to quit on God. I mean, it's a great temptation when you're having to deal with difficulty just to say, well, just forget it then. I give up, forget about God, and forget about this whole system. That is a temptation. But he says, don't be deceived into thinking that God is doing this to you, because really it's your fault that you've fallen into this sin because you gave in to your own desires. God didn't tempt you with this evil because God doesn't do that, verse 13. He isn't tempted, nor does He tempt anyone. But what is the temptation? It can be a blessing to you. It can be of your greater benefit. But we have to understand, first of all, that it's not from God. Well, who's it from then? Well, Paul said back in 2 Corinthians, if you hold your place in James 1, we'll come back in just a little bit. But back in 2 Corinthians again, What we find in verse 7 of chapter 12 is Paul said that his thorn in the flesh was not a messenger from God, but it was a messenger of Satan. He said he's a messenger of Satan to buffet me. The word buffet there is interesting, isn't it? It's not buffet. Sometimes we read that. But the word is buffet. It means to strike with the fist. That's really what the word means. So Satan had brought this hard time upon Paul, and he was using this hard time just to beat Paul down with it. And Paul is saying to God, I'm tired of it. It hurts. I don't want to go through this anymore. It's difficult. Please take it away from me. And he was suffering, but he was suffering from something that originated with Satan. We have to understand that God allows suffering, but He doesn't cause it. That's not in His playbook to cause the suffering. But He's in control of everything, but God allows it. And I think we can come to understand that when we remember what happened with the plight of Job. You remember in Job chapter 2, beginning in chapter 1, we see that Satan came and was questioning God about Job. He's not going to serve you. He's just serving you because he got all this stuff you've given. Take the stuff away, and he won't be faithful to you. Well, God allowed Satan to do some things. God didn't do it. He just allowed Satan to do it. Satan took all of his livestock, took all of his family. Nothing but his wife remained. And that wasn't enough. Satan came back because Job didn't curse God. He didn't give up on him. He came back again in verse 6 of chapter 2 and was questioning God again. Well, you know what? You afflict his health, and then he'll change. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he's in your hand, but spare his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, and Satan struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Who struck Job? Did God do it? No, God didn't do it. As a matter of fact, God says Satan did it. And what a terrible trial Job was going through. It was awful. It's the worst thing that we ever read. Every time we read it, we think, man, alive. That's terrible. But it was the cause of Satan. Satan did those things to Job. And Paul understood that this great trial, this terrible thing that he was going through, well, God didn't cause it, Satan did. But there's a purpose for all of these hard times and these difficulties that we go through. These thorns of life, so to speak, that we sometimes call them, well, they cause us to look to God and not to ourselves. They remind us that we must depend upon God to be able to make it through. I can't do these things on my own. You know, the difficulties of life and the hard times, they are so difficult that I don't have the strength within me to overcome them. I cannot conjure up the strength within myself to make it through all of the difficulties of this life that we're going to face. They're going to be many, sometimes from out of nowhere, some things we never expect. And man doesn't have it within himself to overcome these things by himself and be successful on the other end. He can't do it. And if I lived in a perfect world that wasn't fallen, I would never, ever have this to look to, and I'd never, ever need to look to God. We need to be here in a fallen world. We need to encounter the difficulties of life. I know how hard that is to say, and it's even worse to go through them, but they are a blessing to us. As difficult as they are, they're a blessing to us because they remind me that God is in control and I am not. I'm in a world that is terrible, and I want to go to a world which is not. I realize there's great blessings here. I realize there's lovely things here, but there's nothing more lovely in a place where these difficulties are no longer. We all have to agree with that. And thanks be to God that He allows us to go through these things to remind us that He's faithful. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13, I won't ask you to go back there right now, but you remember, he's writing in regard to temptation there. And he says, let us not deceive ourselves again, He who thinks he stands in regard to the temptations of life. He used the Israelites as an example. Well, they were tempted with all of the things in the wilderness, with trials and other things, and they failed miserably. He's saying to us, don't you fail as they did. Don't you think that you don't need God. You're going to be tempted. You're going to be tried. But God is faithful. That God's always going to give you a way of escape. You're never going to be tempted with more than you can bear because God's going to open you a door and give you the way out. But what does that do? That reminds me that God is faithful. You know who's not faithful? I'm not. You know who else is not faithful? You're not, because we'll always fail. If you're going to put your trust in man, let me just say this, if you're going to put your trust in yourself, guess what? We're destined to fail, aren't we? Because we're weak. But God isn't. God is strong. He's always strong. And another thing is God is always faithful. He will always show up and He will always help us to overcome. Thanks be to God. Because I have hard times and I know you have hard times. And what we learn is that these hard times keep us humble. I told you to hold your place there, did you? Look back with me, James chapter 1. I just want to walk back and read from verse 2 just to bring this into the reading. Just so that we don't miss it. James 1 and verse 2. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. There again, he tells us, he says, you can rejoice in these trials that you're going through. And doesn't that just sound the most foreign, strange thing? Because that's not natural, is it? Most people want to dodge trials and get away from them. But God says you can rejoice in the midst of them because it's creating in you patience, trust, dependence upon God. But you have to do that. You have to depend upon God. Because you know what I don't have when I'm trying to navigate trials? I don't have the wisdom to do it. Not on my own. But what does James say that we need to do? If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to you. But let him ask in faith without doubting, for you doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. That's talking about trust in God. God, I can't do it. I'm at my wit's end and I have nowhere else to go. I've exhausted every measure that I have. I can't make it on my own. God, I'm coming to you for help. I need wisdom. God says, I'll give it to you. I'll give you whatever you need to make it through this successfully as long as you're faithful to me. Don't doubt. Don't doubt God can do it. You know what? My God's much bigger than me. How about you? I think we miss that sometimes. We think that God's going to do things exactly the way we want things to happen in this life because we know what we want. We think that sometimes, don't we? Well, God's going to allow me to live this long because this is the amount of time that I think would be best for me to live. And I'm going to be able to do this, and I'm going to see my children do this. Really? That's not on my end of the stick. But that's on God's end of the stick. God is going to say how long I'm going to be here and what I'm going to accomplish in that amount of time. Or at least as far as the time is concerned. I don't get to choose that. I don't have that type of wisdom to know that. And what it does is it causes me to be humble before Him and to say, well, God, in whatever time you allow me to be here, what I'm going to do is my very best to seek you and your wisdom, especially in these times where I do not know best. I know that you do. I depend upon you. I need your strength to overcome. I won't blame God. I won't doubt God. I'll trust Him. And notice with me, secondly, as James points out here, I'm going to pray to God about it. Well, if you go back to 2 Corinthians 12, that's exactly what Paul did. When Paul was going through the worst time of his life, he prayed about it. It's because Paul understood, and every Christian should, that prayer is a vital part of our life. It's key. We must be able to go and communicate to God in prayer and be able to set aside time to do so. I want you to look back here at verse 8 of 2 Corinthians 12. Paul writes, concerning this thing, that is his thorn that he was dealing with, he said, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. Did you notice what he said? He said, I pleaded with the Lord. You know what that word plead means? It means to beg. He begged God. Can you see him begging God? Over and over again, another time and another time, he's begging with God. I don't know how many people in this room have been to a point like this, but I know some of us probably have. I know I have. Have you ever been on your knees in tears begging God? If not, why not? I can remember a time in my life when I was trying to overcome the old man and I was trying to beat addictions in my life. I can remember being outside in my barn on my knees, crying to God and begging for Him to give me strength to overcome. And you know what my God did? He did it because He's bigger than me. He's stronger than me. I did not have the strength. I could not muster it up on my own, but God did. But I had to pray to Him about it. I set aside time to pray to Him about it over and over and over again. Where did I learn that from? I learned that from Paul. Where did Paul get it? I'd say he got it from Jesus, didn't he? Luke chapter 22. Please walk back there with me. Luke chapter 22. Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane before being arrested and going to the cross. We've talked in times past about what the real problem here was. What was Jesus so upset about? Jesus is going to have to go to the cross. He's going to have to die, but it's what's going to happen in the midst of that. He's going to have to taste a portion of spiritual death so that we would not have to taste it. God's going to turn away from Him in a moment of time that we can't totally explain, but we know it happened. And it was the most terrible moment of Jesus' life, and He knew He was going to have to face that. And in the garden, in Luke chapter 22, beginning in verse 41, let me just remind you what Jesus did in the midst of His most terrible time. When He's in His human body and He knows that He needs to depend upon the Father. When His strength was depleted. It says in verse 41, He was withdrawn from them about a stone's throw, and He knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if it is Your will, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but Yours be done. Then an angel appeared to Him from heaven, strengthening Him. And being in agony, He prayed more earnestly, and His sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Jesus is begging. He's begging the Father about His difficulty and His hard time. We know from Matthew's account He did 3 times. Jesus is begging, but He wants the Father's will to be done, and He got just what He asked for. The Father's will to be done. Jesus to go to the cross to endure this hard time. Jesus in His human mind knew how difficult it was going to be. He knew what He was going to have to go through. And the moment did not call for substitution. The moment called for transformation. And Jesus looked to the Father. He depended upon the Father. He trusted in the Father. He cried out to Him for that strength, and He got it. But it wasn't because He wasn't on His face begging, pleading, sweat becoming like drops of blood. It certainly wasn't a quick fix solution, was it? You know what I think that many times we treat prayer like we're ordering Papa John's. You agree with me? When we want Papa John's, and by the way, I love Papa John's. I love that new stuff they got with the cheese in it. It's good stuff. Hey, I love it. When I want it, I want it. You? What do? We get on the phone, we call them up. Hey, this is what I want. I want one of those new pizzas. You know what I'm talking about. The cheese in it. I want it quick. If you're doing delivery, you want it here within 30 minutes or less. And if you don't get it in 30 minutes or less, you act like they owe you something. You owe me a free pizza next time, one of those good ones like this one. We get upset, don't we? Because we want to call, we want to order, and we want it right when we want it, right now. 30 minutes or less. I think we treat God that way too, if we're not careful. We go to God, God, I got this problem. I want you to deal with it. 30 minutes or less, or you owe me too. You think we do that sometimes? We treat God's avenue of prayer like a quick fix solution. But it should never be that way. It's just not like that. We don't see that from the Scriptures. Prayer should be done with careful consideration and persistence. Look back to chapter 18. Jesus himself, who we've been reading about praying in the garden, well, he taught that before we ever saw him demonstrating it that way. Luke 18, beginning in verse 1, you have the parable of the persistent widow. Jesus said in verse 1, Luke says, let me begin with what Luke said. Then he spoke a parable to them that men always ought to pray and not lose heart. So this parable is about prayer and how prayer should be done. There was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God nor regard man. Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him saying, avenge me of my adversary. And he would not for a while. But afterward he said within himself, though I do not fear God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. Then the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge said. And shall God not avenge his own elect who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? Good question. How many people call their city councilman over and over and over and over again about fixing a street they live on? I think you could probably ask your city councilman, and he'd probably tell you how many times he gets called about that. I mean, just wearing them out over and over again. Oh, we'll plead our case about causes like that. If the pizza's not there in 30 minutes, we're on the phone. Where's my pizza? If it's not there in 5 more minutes, we're on the phone again. Over and over and over again. But when it comes to God, I need it now, do it, take care of it. All right, see you, bye. Should be done in about 30 minutes. And when it doesn't happen, we're just like, God, whatever. I think we may not come out and say that, but I think we may present that sometimes if we're not careful. But Jesus says prayer's not like that at all. Prayer's like that which Jesus was doing. Prayer's like that which Paul was doing. Prayer comes from an understanding that, you know what, I am out of control. I'm lost. I don't have any help. God, I need you now. I need your help. I need your strength. And I'm going to beg and I'm going to plead. And you know, it may not come in the time that I think it should come, but I'm going to keep coming back and I'm going to keep asking and I'm going to keep pleading. And I know that though God may be long-suffering, that He will answer me in His time and it will be speedy. Because it's God's time, not my time. God needs me to go through the trial for a while sometimes. God needs me to kind of ease through the furnace for a while. I may need to be in there a little bit longer, but God knows exactly what I need. And God will take care of that in His time, and it will always be the right time. And when I pray, I need to pray according to God's will, not my own. We sometimes get that backwards. 1 John 5 and verse 14 says that we have this confidence in Him, that whatever we ask according to His will, He hears us. But there again, it's all about an attitude of prayer. It's about a focus, you know. I'm not praying and telling God what I need. I'm asking God to provide what He sees that I need. That's a whole different thing. And I know sometimes I need strength. There's a lot of times that I need strength. How about you? I need to have more confidence in the fact that God will provide. Just let me plead with Him and ask for it. You may be thinking, well, shouldn't God know? Well, sure, He knows, but He wants to know that we know that He is the source. And He wants us to persevere, just like we read in Luke chapter 18. And God always answers, doesn't He? You may be thinking no. You may have been praying to God about something right now for a long time, and you may be thinking, well, God's never answered my prayer. I wonder how long of a time it was that Paul was pleading with God. I think it would be a mistake to say that I know for a fact that those 3 prayers were in one day. I don't know that for a fact. It could have been over a long period of time that Paul is pleading with God and saying, please take the thorn away. I'm tired of it. I can't handle it. But you know what God said to Paul? He said, no. I'm not going to take it away. Because me taking it away is not what you need right now. I need you to trust in me more, depend on me more. And if we could just see our trials that way, that God is taking us through a time, and I know they're hard, I know they're difficult, I have them too. I'm not trying to make light of it. What I'm saying is if we could just take our attitude and turn it and say, God needs me to be here right now so He can make me better. He's making my faith stronger. My dependence upon Him is more and more every day as I keep pleading with Him and asking for help, asking for wisdom. And maybe the answer is no. Maybe He says, no, we're not going to substitute this. I need you to be here and stay here. You know what I think we must do in the midst of that? I think we must do what Paul did, and that is look for blessings in it. Because they are there. They're most certainly there. Was there a blessing in Jesus' trial? And we know there's a blessing in Paul's as well. These things can be beneficial to us, like we've already said. I mean, the things that God is allowing us to go through that He may not cause, they can benefit us greatly. And look at verse 9 of 2 Corinthians 12 again, if you'll turn back there. Notice what he said about his trial and what it was doing for him. After the Lord pretty much told him no, and said to him, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Paul came to realize that his struggles made him more like Christ. Paul said, when I'm at this weakest point in my life, if I'll just look to Him, trust in Him, know that He's going to give me the wisdom that I need to make it through, then that power that Christ used to overcome His trial, He'll give that to me. I'll have that to be able to overcome my trial. I won't ask you to turn to Philippians 2. I think we all pretty well know that. But he's telling the Philippians to have this mind in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. It's that idea of humility that he wanted them to have, not to think, greater of yourself in regard to one another. But Jesus didn't do that. He left heaven. Being equal with God, He did not consider it robbery to be made less than that. He took that on willingly, taking on the form of a man, and was obedient even to the point of death on the cross. Why did Jesus do that? Because He saw blessing in it. Why did Jesus go through all of that? Why did God come to earth and live among sinful men who rejected Him, wanted to kill Him, and ultimately did? It's because He saw the blessing in it. It's because He knew that we could sit here today having forgiveness of our sins and living hope in Him. It was worth it. Are your trials worth it? Are my trials worth it? For me to go through them and just trust in God and find the true source of strength through which we can overcome those things. That's exactly what Paul did. It was in his greatest time of weakness, and I think that's key. It can only be when we get to that point. Because as long as we keep saying, well, I've got this. No one can tell me what to do. I know how to best handle my situations. Stop talking to me about what I need to do. And sometimes I think we say that to God. When somebody's trying to read a passage to us to help us to better shape our thoughts. No, I don't need that. I've got it, man. And really and truly, I don't have it. If I don't have God in the place of being in control, I do not have it. But Paul said, in my weakest moment, that's when I can surrender it all and give it to Jesus, and Jesus can take it over. And then you can find that true source of strength. It's not my wisdom. I've gotten rid of that. Let me just use God's. And then that power to overcome rests upon me. And I think that's why he said in Philippians 4 and verse 13 what he did. Why was he in prison? It's because of sin. He's preaching the gospel to the Gentiles. The Jews hated that. He appealed to Caesar. He had to be in prison. But he even tells the Philippians, if I'm here, it's for your benefit. And going through all this time where he doesn't know he's going to live or die, he's got people making it harder for him. He can't travel and speak with brethren in other places. He says, it's okay. It's worth it. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's where the power is to overcome. It's not within me. These trials that we go through, that you go through and I go through, they're for the purpose of just that, bringing about significant transformation. What was Paul praying for? What in reality was Jesus asking for in the garden? Substitution. Father, take this cup from me. What's Paul asking for? Substitution. Lord, take it from me. I can't deal with it any longer. But what did they all learn? They learned that sometimes substitution isn't the best thing. You see, God knows better than I do. And see, sometimes we get mad. We get upset. We blame God because God doesn't do what we want Him to do. God doesn't follow my plan. But you see the way Jesus handled that? Jesus asked for substitution in the moment. God said, look, no, this is my plan. And Jesus said, your will, not mine. Your plan's better. Paul said, here's my plan, God. Let me present to you my plan. Take it away from me. God said, no, this is my plan. You keep it. Why keep it? Because there's blessing in it, you see. Jesus kept His thorn, if you will, because of the blessing that came from it, our salvation. Paul kept his thorn because of the blessing that came from it, his dependence more on God, the power of Christ resting upon him. You apply that to you and me. What are our trials for? That same purpose. So that we can access that grace and have that salvation. So that we can learn that in our greatest weakness, we can be the strongest we've ever been with the power of Christ resting upon us through obedience and following God's wisdom. And in that, as James has already said, we can rejoice. The world doesn't understand it. But I hope we can come to understand that trials of our life, they're not the terrible things. Oh, they seem that way and they feel that way, don't they? They're these things that we want to avoid, that we want to find a path around. But what God says is, wait, hold on a minute. If you're facing trials right now, no, you focus your mind right through the middle of them. I'll go there with you. And if you go with me, you'll overcome. And these trials, they'll make you better. They'll make you stronger. I think one of the greatest trials that we face, and what this local church has faced in the recent past, a great deal of, is the loss of a loved one. An unexpected loss of a loved one. Wouldn't you agree? That's a heavy trial. And that hurts. And I stand behind what I preached last Sunday night every time a faithful Christian leaves this earth. When God says it's time to go, that's always gain. That's always going to be gain. Now, the people who are left behind, they're going to have a trial in regard to that. There's going to be grieving, and there should be. We've lost a loved one. But you know what we can come to understand even in the midst of that time? God has it. Because I trust in my God that my God is big enough that if He allows for me to leave, He's going to take care of whatever's left behind. We have to trust that God's that big. Because I don't get to choose the time. That's on God's end of the stick. I don't have to worry about those who've left in the Lord. They've gone on to something much better. Thanks be to God for that. But I can also know that those of us who are left behind, who are struggling, who are having a hard time and a difficulty like we should, you know what we can do? We can use this time. We can trust in God and His wisdom and let this not be a stumbling block, but a stepping stone to draw us nearer and nearer to Him. And what that will do is it will form us, shape us, and better fit us for heavenly glory. Isn't that a wonderful thing? That's what trials do when you're a faithful Christian. So bring on the thorns. I know that's hard to say sometimes, but when it comes to the result of us going through them, that's why James says, by way of the Holy Spirit, let us rejoice in such. I hope that's an encouragement to you. It is to me. And I think that's the gospel. If you're here this morning and you haven't obeyed the gospel, you don't have that hope. The trials of this life are only an indication to you of how worse it's going to be in the hereafter. And I pity you. I do not pity you. Let me rephrase that. But it doesn't have to be that way. You can obey the gospel of Jesus Christ, access the blood, have forgiveness of your sins through obedience to the gospel, and heaven can be your home. And we encourage you to do that. We want to help you. If you have questions, please come and talk to us about that. If we can help you make your life right with God in any way this morning, won't you please come while we stand and we sing this song.